Hi there, everyone. Welcome to Jess's Writing Clubhouse. I am your host, the aforementioned Jess. So today is episode 3, and I wanted to kind of deep dive into the main characters of my first male-male romance, The Hunter and The Cultist. Now, I'm hoping that this one doesn't turn into a spiral, but it might. But what I'm hoping to do is to talk about how a character is prior to the start of the story and some history about them, as well as the inspiration and my personal connection to these characters. And maybe also a little bit of history of how they came to be. So the two main characters of The Hunter and the Cultist are Gustav Markov, who is the aforementioned hunter, and then you have Abel Simpson, who is the cultist. And we'll start off with Gustav, since he is the sort of main focus of the story. Each book has both characters learning different things and growing as individuals, but there's always one that changes more than the other one. So that's why I will sometimes say that one of them is the main character. So with Gustav, he's a long time built character. I originally started him, I was probably around 20 or so. I was doing stories and role plays with a couple of my friends, and I came up with this character that kind of resembled Alucard from the anime Hellsing. Now, I hadn't actually watched Hellsing, so this is just what I got from osmosis. And he basically was this guy who had a really sarcastic, snide attitude, but he was incredibly loyal to his master. Now, that's a shamefully one-dimensional kind of character. So when I started to draft out this series, I'm like, okay, I need to fix up Gustav. Now, his name has always been Gustav Markov. I don't know why that name just kind of stuck with me, but it was a name that I really liked and it seemed to fit him. So Gustav, he's always been like in my mind, he's always had these traits. He has shoulder length, straight black hair. He has what I've called crystal blue eyes, so they're like really light and almost to like the robin's egg blue kind of color. He's always been shorter than like the average. He's about 5'8". I think I made him, about 5'8". And he's always been very thin. Like, not like stylishly thin, but like sick thin. And until I actually started to build up his character in his beat sheet, I didn't understand why he kept coming off as this super just not healthy looking person. And his personality, for the most part, stayed the same. He was still very sarcastic, very snide, and basically the term of you don't play well with others kept coming to mind. So what I did was I broke down his character and I found out the whys. And what ended up happening was I realized that he is an incredibly emotionally damaged character. And prior to the start of the story, he is about 300 years old, and he was turned at the age of 12. And the way that the turning process works is that when you're turned, your body goes through basically a either accelerated aging or a decelerated aging. And with Gustav, it was accelerated till he was in about the body of a near 30-year-old. But his brain was still that of a 12-year-old. And it caused a lot of immaturity that he didn't understand. And then with the situation with his sire, Annabelle, it got even worse. I'm not gonna spoil too much about like the why it became worse, but suffice it to say, the situation with Annabelle really kind of screwed with him, and he left after about 8 years. And now, mentally the age of a 20-year-old, he went out and started doing what dudes do. And he lone wolfed it for a long time until he met Samson Livingston, who is the great-grandfather of Henrietta Livingston, who you meet during The Hunter and the Cultist. And he has a very kind of questionable connection to Gustav. They didn't meet under the best circumstances, and too long didn't read. Gustav ended up joining up with his family, and it basically became kind of like that uncle that you just know is there, and he was there for multiple generations. He ended up meeting up with Olivandro Valdim, who is the current head of the Vampire Council, prior to the council actually being formed, and the Hunters Conclave, which is a group that created his job, he helped to create it. And he's one of the original hunters because obviously he helped create it. He is known for how good he is at his job, but he's more known for taking on jobs that most hunters don't want to take. Now, what do I mean by that? It means that he takes on jobs that even hunters who are in his same caliber are like, bro, no. We don't want to do this because it's too dangerous. It's a suicide mission. Gustav goes on that. He's the one that they call when not the impossible, but when most hunters just say hard no. And there's a reason behind that. He has basically a gigantic target on his forehead with himself. He does not want to continue to exist in this plane. He has, mind you, most of this is unconscious. He doesn't realize that his actions are a cry for help, and he just ultimately does not want to be a burden on anyone else. And he actively thinks that it's like, well, maybe if I continue to be this sarcastic, unfeeling asshole, then it'll keep people away and they'll be okay. They won't need to deal with me. And he even thinks about that with his boss, Henrietta Livingston, who is effectively his master. And even though he has such a deep, abiding respect for both Livingston's sisters, and he considers them his children, like his little girls, he will still basically be an asshole to them just to keep them at arm's length. And he doesn't know the why he's doing this. He just knows that it's like, well, I just want to keep them away. So that leads into how he's presented in the beginning of the book as this person that just rubs everyone the wrong way. And he's just an asshole. Like, most people genuinely agree that, yeah, he's good at his job, but he is a fucking nightmare to work with. And the personal connection that I have with him is that a lot of the internal feeling of being a burden on other people is very close to my heart. And I think that comes with a lot of the anxiety and the feeling that you're too much. And if you open up to someone, it's easier to keep people at arm's length, because if you're gone, then they don't have to be sad about it. They can just say, oh, well, good riddance on bad rubbish. And that's ultimately really heartbreaking. And I remember when I was drafting out a scene towards the end, Gustav does end up getting some help for it. And the feeling of validation that he gets is something that I didn't expect to get when I started therapy. And I tear up even thinking about it, because he's so hard on himself and thinking that everyone would be better off with him gone, that he's made it basically his life goal. It's like, this next mission is going to be the one that's going to finally take me out, and then everyone will be okay. And a lot of it comes down to feeling like he got robbed of his life. He got robbed at such a young age by someone who has about the emotional maturity of a 12-year-old, and he would never want that visited upon someone else. And what's tragic is that history does repeat itself a little bit, and it's what pushes him over the edge. And I wanted those parallels to be there, because he's been running away from everything that he's been feeling for 300 years, and he doesn't know how to handle it. And his story is going to evolve as the books go, because this is an expanded world. Characters are going to be featured in other characters' books, and they're still going to continue to grow because they are still people, and they still have journeys to go. And this is just step one. I knew this one was going to be emotional just because talking about my characters and like the meat and bones of it is always hard, because I put a little piece of myself into every one of my characters, and it's just always hard to dig that deep down. So then we go on to Abel Simpson. Now, Abel Simpson had a little bit more of a tumultuous building. Originally in the story that I was writing with my friend. Abel was a young girl named Victoria, still raised in a very religious cult, and because of various plot contrivances, she ended up getting sent to an abusive asylum, and Gustav ends up rescuing her and taking her with him. Now, the broad strokes of that do happen in The Hunter and the Cultist, but there was just something about the character Victoria that didn't fit, and it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like the story that needed to be told. And when I started to conceptualize the series, I'm like, okay, I want to write LGBT literature, and Victoria was like strictly straight, and I'm like, okay, I can't. There's just something about this that's not feeling right. So I'm like, okay, let me change her around. So I changed her into a man. I started calling him Victor, but I'm like, that name don't really fit with a cult, at least in the Old Testament style cult that I'm going for. So I'm like, okay, what's a biblical name? So I went with Abel. And at first, he was basically just male swap from Victoria. It was very weepy, very needy, and didn't have basically personality of a cardboard cutout. And I'm like, I don't like this. I don't like this at all. So I'm like, okay, what's his why? What story is he needing to tell? And what was tricky was that it kept coming up faith, like his faith in God and everything. And I'm like, I don't want to deal with this. Because my family is half Roman Catholic, half Mormon. Now, I will preface this and say that the family that is Mormon is not strict Mormon. They were just raised that way, were fed by the Mormon church, and they're basically alive because the Mormon church takes care of their parishioners. And I've never been very close to religion. In fact, for a long time, I basically just identified as agnostic. So it was very difficult to kind of get into the mindset of someone who would be that stringent in their beliefs. And I'm like, okay, what is it about faith that he's struggling with? And the one thing that kept popping up was that because of the fact that he would be a man attracted to other men, that's very much something that would be against this cult's teachings. It's like, okay, so that's part of it, but it doesn't feel like that's the whole of it. Yeah, that's a chink in the armor of his faith, but what is it that really breaks his faith? What is it that pushes him to question it? And it's ultimately the loss of his world. The entire loss of his home, his family, his friends, everything he's ever known just being ripped away from him. And believing that if God was real, he wouldn't have let this happen to such true believers. And him not being able to reconcile that all of this death and destruction happened on God's watch. And it kind of harkened back to something that my mom has said a lot. It's like, if God was such this great person, this great being, why would he let good people hurt? Why would he let good people suffer? And I never had an answer for that. And there's one of my favorite shows is MASH. And they actually had an episode where a character believes he's Jesus Christ, and he was a former fighter pilot. And one of the characters, Father Mulcahy, is a priest. And he asks him, it's like, is it true that God hears all prayers? And this guy says, yes. And after a beat, he says, sometimes the answer is no. And that helped with some of my understanding. But when Abel is raised in this belief that if you're a strong enough believer, God will take care of you, how do you reconcile that? How do you handle it when your world is turned upside down and everything that you believed is thrown up in the air? Because the same religion that he's been raised to believe would condemn him and the man he loves to hell just for being who they are. And it's something that he ends up dealing with throughout the story. And at the same time, he also has something that is going on with him that he's not even aware of is happening. Because early on, even before he loses everything, he is hearing this voice speak to him that he's always kind of thought of as his conscience. But it's not actually his conscience. And throughout the story, he speaks to this person. And Their name is Solita. She is actually the very first vampire that was ever created, and she is the mother of vampires. She is now heralded as a goddess, part of a religion, and there's some things about why she's specifically coming to Abel, but she basically tells him that because he was raised in faith, he has to still have some kind of faith within him, even if it's not for a religion. He needs to have faith that he can overcome anything, and he needs to have faith in those around him. And it's not that she wants him to follow her doctrine and everything like that, but he needs to find something to believe in now that his world has been turned upside down. And he is kind of my way of working out my feelings towards religion and belief. And it was very cathartic because towards the end, he ends up standing in front of a congregation of people who believe in Solita, and he tells them what happened. He tells them about his loss of faith and how Gustav and, by extension, his new son Grayson have basically opened his eyes to what he needs to believe in and what is going to be the most beneficial to him. And he has this whole community that is willing to support him for who he is, not for the prayers that he needs to do every day, not for believing in some doctrine that is unyielding. And he finds people that just, how do I put this? He finds a community that is willing to love him for him and not ask anything of him. Just 100% love. And that is ultimately all he needed. He needed to belong to a community that wasn't going to judge him for what he's done. Just love him. And I lovingly call Abel my problem child because of how much work it took to actually get him to, or at least get me to understand his story, because he was through so many iterations. I couldn't figure him out. He just kept hiding shit from me. And finally, when I broke through that, and it's like, that's why you didn't want to talk about it. That's why you didn't want me to break everything down, because you had lost your faith. You didn't trust that faith anymore. So Abel was definitely a work in progress. Even though Gustav does the most changing, Abel was a lot of heavy lifting because of just, the amount of work. The amount of frickin' work I had to do with him. But I wanted Abel to have a very distinctive physical difference between Gustav. Whereas Gustav is short, Abel is about 6'4", and he has curly red hair, and Gustav describes his eyes as being the deepest green. And he has a very, rugged, strong build, and his clothing style is anything that is durable, can last long, and fits, because it's function over form. And it drives Henrietta crazy because she's very much about appearances. And Abel is one of my favorite characters now, mostly because of the work that he required me to put in for him. I will do one little special shout out to a character that kind of came about through the original roleplay, but really grew into his own as I started drafting him, which is Gustav and Abel's son, Grayson. Now, Grayson comes in as part of Gustav's story, and as I mentioned before, history has a tendency to repeat itself. Grayson, at the time of the story, is 12 years old. His parents, his father and his stepmother, are unfortunately a target for Annabelle, and Grayson is left an orphan. So Gustav and Abel take him in because who else is going to know what this kid is going through than Gustav. And they start being basically parents to him and even try and protect him from Annabelle, even though she is very tenacious and visits the same initial trauma that Gustav went through upon Grayson. And he is in the same position that Gustav was in, but now, unlike Gustav, he has a support system that can help him through what he's going through. And I really like Grayson. He's still kind of a mystery to me. I'm slowly building up his story, and I hope that as I build him up, I'm able to get a better idea of the person that he is. I know what he is prior to his story, but I don't know who he is as a person. And I'm really interested to see where he goes with that later on, because he does get his own book, and I'm very excited for him to get his own book. So I'm hoping that all of you will also be excited for that. Now, this was kind of a heavy one because we're talking about a lot of psychological issues that my characters deal with, because that's one thing that I really kind of lean into is the psychological aspect of why a person does things. And I hope that this hasn't been too heavy. I will be putting trigger warnings on the top of this with the description. So if there's any problems, then you'll know before you actually start listening that these are the topics that I'm going to be talking about. So I thank you all for listening. I really appreciate all of you being here to listen, and I will speak with you all next time. Bye-bye.